In the quiet town of Jonesboro, Arkansas, the Despain household appeared to be the epitome of suburban calm. But beneath the surface, secrets festered, leading to a shocking act of betrayal that would leave the entire community reeling. Marc Despain, a well-liked real estate appraiser, had no idea that the people closest to him were plotting his demise. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Despain home, casting delicate shadows on the polished wooden floors. It was an ordinary day in Jonesboro, Arkansas. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the distant murmur of children playing a few houses down. Inside the Despain residence, however, a storm was brewing beneath the facade of suburban calm, a storm that would soon erupt, leaving the entire town stunned. Marc Despain, a well-liked real estate appraiser, had no idea that his life was about to come to a brutal end. As he sat in his home office, reviewing paperwork, there were no signs that his most trusted confidants had betrayed him. He smiled absent-mindedly at a framed photo on his desk, he and his wife, Michelle, on a beach, their arms wrapped around each other. To Marc, his life seemed perfect, yet unseen shadows loomed closer. Michelle Despain stood in the kitchen, her fingers tapping restlessly against the marble countertop. Her gaze was vacant, her mind a million miles away, plotting the perfect crime. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman preparing dinner, but the truth was far more sinister. She was waiting for the storm that she had orchestrated to arrive. The hitman was supposed to be here soon, and there was no turning back now. Carl Kelly, Michelle's father, felt his heart pound as he drove through the back streets of Jonesboro. The road seemed longer today, as if fate was giving him one last chance to turn back. The thought of his daughter and her crumbling marriage had eaten away at him for months, and this terrible plan felt like the only way to ensure she was free. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to know the part he played in what was about to unfold. But family loyalty, that ancient and twisted sense of obligation, propelled him forward. The man hired for the job, parked a block away from the Despain house. He sat for a moment in the worn-out car, eyes closed, feeling the weight of the gun beneath his jacket. His mind flickered with thoughts: money, desperation, and fear all tangled together like barbed wire. It wasn't supposed to be this way, he told himself. But desperation has a way of warping a man's conscience, and today, he would cross the line forever. The clock struck 3 as Marc continued working, unaware of the creeping danger. The silence of the house was broken by the sound of the door opening. He looked up, expecting Michelle, maybe even a friend. Instead, it was Johnny, his face twisted in a blend of determination and fear. Marc's eyes met Johnny's, confusion clouding his features before realization dawned, but by then, it was already too late. The gunshot echoed through the halls, a sound so out of place that it seemed to hang in the air like an unshakable mist. The children's laughter from down the street faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Michelle, standing in the kitchen, closed her eyes as the sound reverberated. Her heart raced, and her fingers dug into the countertop. It was over. What she had set into motion had come to a terrible fruition. Johnny stared at the lifeless body of Marc on the floor, the enormity of his actions sinking in. His pulse roared in his ears as he backed out of the room, almost stumbling over his own feet. He had expected a quick job, but nothing could have prepared him for the cold emptiness that now swallowed him whole. He fled, his steps echoing in the quiet house, each one taking him further from the scene of his irreversible crime. Michelle took a deep breath and forced herself to walk into the hallway, her expression calm. She would call the police soon. She knew what she had to say, how to act. Tears would come when they needed to. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, every detail planned. The fear she had anticipated, the guilt she had dreaded, they were nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only a chilling emptiness, a hollow echo where her heart used to be. The police arrived at the scene, the flashing red and blue lights casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood. Officers moved with precision, their faces grim as they entered the house. The crime scene was carefully analyzed, the details recorded, but the truth lay buried beneath layers of deceit. Michelle cried on cue, her voice breaking as she spoke to the officers, her story well practiced and flawless. Carl Kelly, at home, received the call from Michelle. It was done. He closed his eyes and leaned against the wall, the weight of his actions crushing him. He had promised to protect his daughter, but this. He didn't know if he could live with what he had done, but he had to try. It was, after all, for Michelle. For her future. For her happiness at least, that's what he told himself. Neighbors gathered in the street, whispering to one another, their eyes wide with shock. Marc Despain was gone, and the entire community felt the impact. The man who had once greeted them with a smile and a wave, who had been a part of their lives, was now nothing more than a name in a police report. Suspicion lingered in the air, but no one could have imagined the tangled web of betrayal that lay behind his death. Johnny ran, his mind a blur of fear and regret. He had done it for the money, for a chance at a better life, but now all he felt was the cold grip of horror. He knew he couldn't escape this, not really. The image of Marc's lifeless eyes would follow him forever, a constant reminder of the line he had crossed, the soul he had lost. Michelle sat alone in the living room that night, the house eerily silent. The memories of her marriage flashed before her eyes, the good times, the laughter, the love. But those moments had long since faded, replaced by resentment, by frustration. She had made her choice, and now, there was no turning back. She was free, but at what cost? The investigation moved swiftly, but Michelle remained composed. She answered every question, played the grieving widow flawlessly. She watched as Marc's friends and family gathered to mourn, their faces twisted in grief. Her own tears flowed on command, her voice breaking as she spoke of her love for her late husband. It was all part of the plan. Carl Kelly, haunted by his own actions, found solace in denial. He told himself it was for Michelle, that it had to be done. But the truth gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his betrayal. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The weight of his guilt was suffocating, but he forced himself to carry on, for his daughter's sake. The weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, questions, and false leads. The police worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of the crime, but the truth remained hidden. Michelle watched as the investigation unfolded, her heart pounding with each passing day. She had planned everything, but the fear of being caught never truly left her. Johnny, hiding in the shadows, felt his world crumbling. He had killed a man, and now, he was a fugitive. The money he had been promised felt like a curse, a reminder of the darkness he had embraced. He knew he couldn't run forever, that eventually, the truth would catch up to him. After Marc's brutal murder, his wife Michelle and her father Carl tried to cover up their involvement, but the truth weighed heavily on them. Michelle played the grieving widow flawlessly, but Detective Harris grew increasingly suspicious. Meanwhile, Johnny, the hired hitman, found himself haunted by the crime, unable to escape his guilt. The days turned into weeks, and the community of Jonesboro tried to move on, but the shadow of Marc Despain's death loomed large. The whispers in the neighborhood grew louder, speculating on what could have led to such a tragic event. Michelle played her role perfectly, but even the best of masks can crack under pressure. She started noticing the stairs' neighbors, who once greeted her warmly, now looked at her with suspicion. Michelle sat in her car one afternoon, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. She could feel the weight of her lies bearing down on her, suffocating her. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Marc's face, his confused eyes, the moment he realized the betrayal. She had wanted freedom, but all she had gained was a prison of her own making. Carl, on the other hand, found solace in his routine, anything to distract him from the crushing guilt. He spent hours working in his garage, trying to drown out the memories of what he had set into motion. But it was futile. The past had a way of creeping in, seeping into every quiet moment, every silent night. He knew Michelle was struggling, but he couldn't bring himself to face her. They had both crossed a line, and now, they were both paying the price. The police continued their investigation, and while Michelle had thought they were off her trail, she could feel them closing in. A detective named Harris had taken a special interest in the case. He was meticulous, methodical, and he had a gut feeling that there was more to Marc's death than met the eye. He watched Michelle during interviews, noticing the small tells, the way her eyes shifted, the hesitation in her voice. Something didn't add up. Johnny, now on the run, felt his life unraveling. He had taken the money, but it brought him no comfort. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The image of Marc's lifeless body haunted his every waking moment. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. The guilt was eating him alive, and the fear of being caught was a constant companion. He had made a choice, and now, he was living the consequences. One evening, Michelle received a call from Detective Harris. He wanted to meet just a few more questions, he said. Her heart pounded as she agreed, her mind racing with what she would say. She had been careful, but Harris's persistence unnerved her. She knew that one wrong word could unravel everything. As she hung up the phone, she felt a chill run down her spine. The walls were closing in. Carl watched from a distance as Michelle struggled. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He had promised to protect her, but now, it seemed like there was nothing he could do. The guilt was unbearable, but he forced himself to carry on. He couldn't let Michelle see his weakness, not now, not when she needed him to be strong. Detective Harris met Michelle at a small cafe in town. He watched her carefully as she spoke, her words rehearsed, her demeanor calm. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear, a hint of guilt. He leaned in, his voice gentle but probing. He asked about Marc, about their marriage, about the day he died. Michelle answered each question, her smile never faltering, but inside, she was crumbling. Harris left the cafe that day more convinced than ever that Michelle was hiding something. He knew it would take time, but he was patient. He had seen cases like this before, people who thought they could get away with murder, who thought they were smarter than everyone else. But the truth had a way of coming out, and he was determined to find it. Michelle returned home, her nerves frayed. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of her lies crushing her. She had thought she could handle it, that she could move on, but the fear of being caught was always there, lurking in the shadows. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marc, his eyes wide with shock, his body crumpling to the floor. Johnny, now desperate and alone, made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. He needed to come clean, to confess. He knew it would mean prison, but at least it would be over. The constant fear, the guilt, the nightmares, he couldn't take it anymore. He picked up the phone and dialed the police station, his heart pounding as he waited for someone to answer. Detective Harris received the call that night. A man wanted to confess to the murder of Marc Despain. Harris's heart raced as he listened, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. He arranged to meet Johnny, his mind racing with the possibilities. This was it, the break he had been waiting for. Michelle was at home when the knock on the door came. Her heart sank as she opened it to find officers standing there. They were polite, but their eyes were cold. They had a warrant, they said. They needed her to come with them. She felt her world shatter as they placed her in handcuffs, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. Carl watched from his window as his daughter was taken away. He felt his heart break, the weight of his actions finally crushing him. He had done this, he had set this in motion. He had promised to protect her, but now, she was alone, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Detective Harris sat across from Johnny in the interrogation room. Johnny's hands shook as he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. He told them everything: the money, the plan, the shot. Harris listened, his face impassive, but inside, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The truth was finally coming out, and Marc Despain would get the justice he deserved. Michelle sat in her cell that night, her mind numb. She had wanted freedom, but now, all she had was a tiny, cold room and the crushing weight of her choices. She had thought she could outsmart everyone, but in the end, the truth had caught up to her. And now, she would pay the price for her betrayal. Carl, alone in his garage, felt the tears finally come. He had lost everything: his daughter, his family, his soul. He had thought he was doing the right thing, but now, he knew the truth. There was no justification, no excuse. He had betrayed his own blood, and now, he would live with that guilt for the rest of his life. The community of Jonesboro was left in shock as the truth came out. Marc Despain had been betrayed by those closest to him, his life taken in a cold, calculated act of greed and desperation. The town mourned, but the shadows of that betrayal lingered, a reminder that sometimes, the real monsters are the ones hiding behind familiar smiles.
Jonesboro, Arkansas. You know, picture a town where life moves a little slower, neighbors chatting across fences, kids riding bikes, that kind of place.
Peaceful.
Exactly, peaceful. But as we're about to uncover, even in the most idyllic places, darkness can be lurking just beneath the surface. This is the story of Marc Despain.
And it's a twisted one. This isn't just a simple murder case. It's a deep dive into a web of betrayal, family secrets, and the high cost of freedom.
We're talking about a man living what seemed to be a completely normal life, right up until the moment it was tragically cut short.
And the people responsible. Well, they were the ones closest to him, the ones he should have trusted the most.
His own wife, Michelle, and her father, Carl Kelly, are at the heart of this case.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating. It forces us to consider how well we really know the people around us, even the ones we think we know best.
So let's rewind. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details of the crime itself, let's paint a picture of Marc Despain's life in Jonesboro. He was a real estate appraiser, well-liked in the community, seemingly happily married, or at least that's what everyone believed.
And that's the thing about facades, right?
Yeah.
They're often very convincing until they're not.
Our sources paint a picture of a man who, on the surface, seemed to have it all. A loving wife, a comfortable life, respect from his peers.
But like you said, that was just the surface. Behind that carefully constructed image of a happy marriage, there was another story unfolding. A story of marital discord, of a wife desperately seeking a way out.
And that wife, Michelle Despain, becomes a central figure in this whole thing. From what we can piece together, it seems her desire for freedom wasn't just about wanting to leave a bad marriage. It went much deeper, didn't it?
That's exactly right. And to understand Michelle's motivations, we have to dig into the psychology of this situation. We've got court documents, psychological evaluations, all sorts of things that provide glimpses into her state of mind. And what they reveal is a woman who felt incredibly trapped, suffocated by her marriage.
So we're not just talking about wanting a fresh start, a new chapter. This was about erasing her old life completely.
Precisely. And to achieve that, she needed a plan. A plan so audacious, so morally reprehensible that it would send shockwaves through Jonesboro and beyond.
And that's where her father, Carl Kelly, enters the scene. What kind of a father agrees to participate in something like this?
It's a question that haunts this entire case. The sources suggest Carl was a man deeply conflicted. He loved his daughter, but he also had a very specific, some might even say warped, sense of how to protect her.
Twisted family loyalty.
Exactly. It's this twisted sense of familial obligation that ultimately leads him down a very dark path.
So he goes from concerned dad to accomplice to murder. What happened there?
It's a slippery slope, isn't it? From wanting to fix your daughter's problems to believing that you have the right to take matters into your own hands. And in Carl's case, that belief leads him to make a series of choices that have devastating, irreversible consequences.
But they couldn't pull this off alone, could they?
You're right. They needed someone on the outside, someone who could, well,
do their dirty work.
Exactly. And that's where Johnny the hitman comes in.
Okay, so let's talk about Johnny. He's a fascinating character in all of this.
Absolutely. His story adds a whole other layer to this. From what we can tell, he was a man facing some hard times. Maybe struggling financially, maybe just feeling lost. But he was definitely vulnerable.
The kind of person who might be tempted by a quick payday, even if it means compromising their morals.
Exactly. And that's exactly what Michelle and Carl preyed on his desperation. They offered him a way out, but at a horrific cost.
And it's important to remember that Johnny wasn't a seasoned criminal, at least not at first.
That's a good point. The sources indicate he actually struggled with the decision. He understood the gravity of what he was being asked to do.
But in the end, the allure of the money, the promise of a better life, it was just too much to resist.
It was a classic case of trying to rationalize a horrific act, trying to convince himself it was just a job, a means to an end.
But as we'll see, that kind of thinking rarely holds up in the face of reality, does it?
Not usually. The reality of what he was about to do to take a human life was much more complex, much more haunting than he could have ever imagined.
And so the stage is set. We've got a wife desperate for freedom, a father blinded by a twisted sense of loyalty, and a hitman caught in the middle of their deadly scheme.
And as the sun begins to set on Jonesboro, casting long shadows across that quiet, unsuspecting town, Johnny finds himself on Marc Despain's doorstep, about to change the course of their lives forever.
A seemingly ordinary summer evening, about to be shattered by an act of unspeakable violence. An act that would expose the darkness lurking beneath the surface of Jonesboro, and the secrets that bound together a husband, a wife, and the hitman who sealed their fates. It's hard to imagine the ripple effect that gunshot must have had. One moment, Jonesboro is this peaceful, idyllic town, and the next, it's the scene of a shocking crime.
It's like the moment shattered the illusion of peace, you know? Suddenly, everyone's looking around, wondering if they ever really knew their neighbors, their community.
And in the midst of all that chaos, the investigation begins.
Right, and this is where Detective Harris enters the picture. Now, Harris, he wasn't your typical headline-grabbing detective. He was known more for his quiet determination, his ability to blend in, to observe.
The kind of guy who could read a room like a book, maybe pick up on things others might miss.
Exactly. And from the very beginning, something about Michelle's story didn't sit right with him. It wasn't anything obvious, mind you, more like out. Those subtle inconsistencies, those tiny cracks in her carefully constructed facade.
Those little details that often get overlooked, but to a trained eye, they scream volumes. What kind of things was he noticing about her?
Well, according to the reports, it was a combination of things. Her body language often contradicted her words. Like she'd say one thing, but her posture, her facial expressions, they'd tell a different story.
Almost like she was acting a part, but not quite pulling it off.
Exactly. And then there were those pauses, those hesitations before she answered certain questions. Almost like she was carefully considering each word, making sure it aligned with whatever narrative she was trying to spin.
Trying to maintain control of the situation, even as it was clearly spiraling out of control.
Right, and Harris, he picked up on all of it. He knew she was hiding something, and he was determined to break through that wall she had built around herself.
So, while Detective Harris is slowly peeling back the layers of Michelle's story, what's happening with Johnny? He's the one who actually pulled the trigger. What's going through his mind during all of this?
Well, imagine the weight of what he'd done. He'd taken a life, and now he's living with the consequences. The money, the promise of a better life, it probably felt like a million miles away.
The guilt, the fear, the paranoia, it must have been absolutely suffocating.
It was. In fact, sources close to Johnny describe him as a shell of his former self. He was haunted by nightmares, constantly looking over his shoulder, unable to escape the reality of his actions.
And the money, I imagine that wasn't bringing him much comfort at that point.
Not at all. If anything, it probably felt like a constant, tangible reminder of the life he took. Every dollar, a symbol of his guilt, a weight dragging him further down.
And what about Carl? He's right in the thick of it too. How's he coping with all of this, knowing he played a role in this whole scheme?
Carl's a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance. On one hand, he's a father who loves his daughter, and he convinced himself that he was protecting her.
But on the other hand, he crossed a line, a massive line. How do you rationalize that?
You can't. Not really. And I think deep down, Carl knew that. He allowed his love for Michelle, his need to fix her problems, to cloud his judgment, to lead him down a path of destruction.
So we've got Michelle trying to maintain this facade of innocence, Johnny drowning in guilt and paranoia, and Carl grappling with the weight of his choices. What happens next? What starts to unravel this whole conspiracy?
Well, it's a combination of factors. Detective Harris's persistence is a big one. He just had this gut feeling that Michelle was involved, and he refused to let go.
Like a dog with a bone.
Exactly. He kept digging, kept asking questions, kept looking for those little inconsistencies that would expose the truth. And then this is Johnny. Remember how we were talking about the weight of his guilt?
Yeah, he was barely holding it together, right?
Right. Well, it eventually becomes too much for him, the bear. He reaches a breaking point.
It cracks.
He cracks. And in a stunning turn of events, he decides to confess.
Can you imagine being Detective Harris? All those weeks, all those hours, chasing dead ends, piecing together tiny clues, and then boom, Johnny walks in and lays it all out. Talk about a break in the case.
Oh, absolutely. It completely changes the game. This wasn't just a lucky break anymore. This was the domino that set everything else in motion.
And I bet it sent shockwaves through Jonesboro. This wasn't just some random crime anymore. This was a calculated act, orchestrated by people they knew, people they trusted.
It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about someone, doesn't it? And for Michelle and Carl, the game was up.
No more hiding behind that facade of normalcy.
No, the truth was out, and they were going to have to face the consequences.
So what happens next? Do they try to deny it to come up with some other explanation?
Well, the sources suggest that there was a brief attempt by their lawyers to, muddy the waters a bit, but it was pretty clear that the evidence was stacked against them.
The jig was up.
Exactly. And so the focus shifted. It was no longer a question of if they were involved, but why. What could possibly drive someone to commit such a cold-blooded act?
And those are the questions that would be at the heart of the trial. A trial that would captivate Jonesboro and expose the darkest corners of human nature.
The trial was a media frenzy, of course. Cameras everywhere, reporters from all over trying to get a glimpse into the lives of these seemingly ordinary people who had committed such a horrific act.
It's like something out of a movie. But for the people of Jonesboro, this was all too real.
It was. And as the trial progressed, more and more details about the case came to light. The prosecution laid out a very compelling narrative, backed up by evidence, witness testimony, and of course, Johnny's confession.
And Michelle and Carl, how did they plead?
Both pleaded not guilty.
Despite the evidence.
Despite the evidence.
Wow. I guess when you're backed into a corner like that, sometimes denial is the only defense mechanism you have left.
Right. And in a way, I think their not guilty pleas were more about clinging to the last shred of control they had left.
But it wasn't going to change the outcome, was it?
No, the writing was on the wall. The evidence was too overwhelming. And in the end, the jury reached a verdict.
Guilty.
Guilty on all counts. Michelle and Carl were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Johnny, because of his cooperation, received a reduced sentence.
Wow. What a tragic end to a story that began in a place that seemed so peaceful, so idyllic. It's a stark reminder that things aren't always as they appear, and that even in the quietest corners of the world, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge.
Absolutely. And sometimes those closest to us, the ones we trust the most, are the ones harboring the darkest secrets. The Jonesboro betrayal is a case that stays with you, forcing you to confront the complexities of human nature and the fine line between love, obsession, and the devastating consequences of our choices.
It's a story that reminds us that the truth always has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. And sometimes the price of freedom is higher than we're willing to pay.
In August 2011, Marc Despain, a real estate appraiser from Jonesboro, Arkansas, was found shot to death in his home. The investigation revealed a complex murder-for-hire plot driven by family betrayal, financial disputes, and greed. Marc's wife, Michelle Despain, was at the center of the conspiracy, alongside her father, Carl Kelly, and her nephew, Travis Ray Kelly. Michelle Despain and Marc had been facing marital issues, largely driven by financial problems. Investigators discovered that Michelle, in collaboration with her father, conspired to have Marc killed for financial gain, including an insurance payout. Carl Kelly hired Johnny Hubbard, an acquaintance, to carry out the murder. Additionally, Travis Ray Kelly played a supporting role in organizing and coordinating the plan. Michelle Despain, she took a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison for hindering apprehension. Carl Kelly, the mastermind of the plot, Carl Kelly, received a life sentence for his role in orchestrating the murder. Johnny Hubbard, the hitman, who carried out the actual killing, was also sentenced to life in prison. Travis Trey Kelly, he cooperated with authorities and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his involvement in the planning stages. The case drew significant media attention due to the shocking nature of the family betrayal and the intricate relationships between those involved. It was featured on popular true crime shows like Dateline NBC and Snapped, where the tragic downfall of Marc Despain was explored in detail. Ultimately, the pursuit of financial gain led to a devastating chain of events, culminating in the murder of a husband and father, and the unraveling of a family.